We've been working our way through over 3 different Sundays, these 3 topics, which is work and service, money and possessions, and rest and retirement. Now we're going to have a little think now about another great recent theologian, what they had to say on this particular topic. This one's a bit more challenging than some of the last 2 that we've had. So does anyone know this one? So I've been working all week. I'm tired. Yeah, I've been working all week. Now, this could be any of you. I appreciate that. And I'm just living for the weekend. There's the clue. Anyone know? Okay, Living for the Weekend by Hard-Fi, that one's from. So that's maybe a bit sort of Britpoppy. But anyway, let's move on. There's another one here. So what about this one? Many years have passed since those summer days among the fields of barley. See the children run as the sun goes down, fields of gold. Yeah, familiar with that one by Sting? So we've got 2 different ones there. One which is just living for the weekend. If I can just get through this week, I'll live for the weekend and everything will be fine. And the other one, which is somebody who's reached the latter stages of their life, let's call it that, and they're looking back on their life and the images that are going through in their mind. And the one that just keeps coming up to them is this idea of the fields of gold and seeing what happens there. So we're going to deal with effectively 2 issues here, this topic of rest and retirement. So one is rest and the other is retirement. And as I've worked my way through this, it should have been 2 messages, but we're going to cram it all together and see what we can possibly fit in today. So we're going to deal with this rest and retirement topic. So let's just have a think back over our preceding 2 weeks. Realise that you were away on your church weekend last weekend, so you need a bit of a recap, I suspect. What we understood is this, that our whole life matters to God, that there isn't a secular and a sacred divide that we are told exists. Now, I'm sure the evil one says to us, oh, well, that bit, yeah, of course, keep that little bit for God, but actually the rest of it's all yours. You can do whatever you want with. As long as you give God that bit, then just do the rest yourself. But no, everything that we have can be used to God's glory. We even thought that about our workplaces, what we do during the week, the clubs we belong to, the societies, the tennis club, the golf club, whatever it is, they can all be used for the glory of God. We also recognize that everything belongs to God, and we are simply stewards of what God has first given to us. What that means is we don't keep it in perpetuity. We won't have it forever. We have to leave it at some stage. And therefore, what we have during this life is simply what God has entrusted to us. And therefore, we are accountable for that. We are accountable for how we use our gifts. We are accountable for how we use the wealth, how we've used our employment, how we've used our property. We are accountable for all the things that God has entrusted to us during our lives. So that's what we've learned about those previous 2 topics. And it's really important that we understand those first, because ultimately our rest and retirement aspects are typically governed by our work and typically governed by our wealth. So in other words, the affordability of what we do at the weekend, or the affordability of what we're going to do in later life. Those things are wrapped up together. So we need to understand those things first before we come on to this topic. So let's apply the same principles in that case before we start looking at the Bible together, which we'll move on to in just a second. So our whole life matters to God. It's not just your Sunday that matters to God. It isn't simply whether you come to the study group later in the week. Every part of your life matters to God. There is no secular sacred divide. Everything should be used for God's glory, and therefore everything belongs to God. So in other words, all the things that we've already learned, we can then apply to this topic today. So let's just crack on then and have a look at rest, the topic of rest. So as you might recall 2 weeks ago, when we looked at, longer back than that, 3 weeks ago actually, we looked at the topic of work. And it's helpful to see what the world looks like before sin came into it. And that's what we're going to do when we look at the topic of rest. So I've got Genesis 1 on there. Sorry, it's all a bit crammed on. I'm not going to read through every single verse, but this is the creation account starting at verse 24. And it says, "And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kind." And then we just go on. And we're just sort of dealing in a few words with God creating everything, aren't we? Which is just very, very unfair. But it's really just to give some sort of context that God has made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground. And God saw that it was good. And then God comes to the pinnacle of his creation. God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. And we read this, so they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the air, the livestock, the wild animals, and all the creatures. So God creates them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. Let's go on. God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the earth. And then we get to this, chapter 2, beginning of chapter 2. Oh, sorry, I've skipped a bit. My apologies. Beginning of chapter 2, we read this. We read this. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. And then we read this. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating what he had done. So it's the seventh day in creation, but what day was it for mankind? It's their first day. You realise that? Their first full day was a day of rest. That's how important rest is to God, and that's how important rest should be for us. That after God had made everything in 6 days, he then rests, and that was the first day that the people he had made, or the man he had made, then had communion with him. Isn't that an amazing thing? In fact, so much so, now I've brought not all my library, just a little bit today, just to point out a few things that you might want to consider looking at reading. This is an amazing book called First Day, and it takes exactly that theme. The way that we should consider Sabbath, it was the first thing that God gave to us. The first day was the day of rest. So have a think about that. Anyway, so how important is rest? So this is the God who has made everything. So God is all-powerful. We use a word called omnipotent for that. He is all-powerful. And yet, he chose to rest. Amazing. He could have just kept on going, but he chose to rest. God is all-knowing. Again, we like to use a fancy word for that, omniscient. Yet he chose to stop and look at the perfection in his creation. He said it was very good. God is everywhere. And again, we use the word omnipresent for that. Yet he took time to enjoy his work. He almost stepped away from it to look back on it. That's how important rest is, that the God who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and everywhere still chose to rest. And if he considers it to be important, then how much more important is it for us who are confined to one space in time, don't know everything and can't be everywhere, and certainly don't know everything. So all of those things considered, rest is crucial for us. Again, if we look at the New Testament, we come to Mark 2, and there's a story there about how Jesus and his disciples were being chastised for the way in which they were treating the Sabbath. And Jesus says, the Sabbath being the day of rest, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man, that is Jesus, is Lord even of the Sabbath. That's how important it is that we rest. And that's really why we looked at that passage in Exodus, which you might have thought was a bit of a strange one, because we had lots of collecting and baking and boiling. You thought, what's this all got to do with the Sabbath? So let's just skip on to the bit that's particularly relevant there. So this was about the children of Israel. They're in the wilderness and they're moaning. which was pretty much their profession of moaning about what was going on. But then we are much the same, aren't we? So, yeah, that's how it is. It's just mankind, I think. But they were moaning about not having any food. And so God, in a miraculous way, provides these two forms of food, quail and manna. And the manna is not like anything that we've ever seen before or since, how it would appear on the ground, they would collect it. And we read this, that in verse 22, and again, sorry, it's all squeezed in a little bit, but on the sixth day they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person. And the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. He said to them, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil, save whatever is left and keep it until morning." And essentially that's what they did. As long as they were obedient to that, it all worked out fine. Any other day when they retained the manna, it went off. But from the 6th day through to the 7th day, it didn't. There was enough. It was a miracle how God would provide them with double and allow it to be retained, and it wouldn't go off. And again, there's the challenge there in verse 29. Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That is why on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the 7th day. No one is to go out. So the people rested on the Sabbath on the 7th day. So why do you think there wasn't manna on the 7th day? I mean, it wouldn't have been a huge hardship, would it? Just sort of go out, collect a bit in, stick it in the oven. Well, it wouldn't have been a huge amount of work. Well, there are, I think, 3 key reasons why there was no manna on the 7th day. The first is so that the people could rest. Okay, they'd been baking and boiling all day long for 6 days. And it came to the 7th day and they didn't have to, because whatever they'd prepared would still keep. Second reason is that this wasn't a coincidence. Okay, this didn't just happen to be like that. It's that's what God had planned. That's what God had planned, so that he could clearly say, this is going to happen, and this is going to happen, and that's exactly what happened. But I think this is the third reason too, and I think this is really important for us. He did this so that they would be more dependent on him. Because if the food was still there the next day, on the 7th day, then it was just carrying on what had happened the day before and the day before that. But this way, if they followed his instructions closely, he would provide for them. And that really is a challenge to us. Why should we live in a Sabbath way? Do you remember those? You don't really see them so much now, but there used to be stickers that were on the back of a car that would say, "A dog is for life, not just for Christmas." Do you remember that? And yeah, I mean, I'm into that. I'm right behind that, totally. But we should have stickers that say something along the lines of, "A Sabbath isn't a day, it's a way of life." Because that's what the Bible teaches us. The Bible teaches us that it's not simply about observing a day. It's about having complete trust and confidence in God to provide, which was the purpose of the Sabbath. So the purpose is that we can rest. The second is that we don't take the credit. It's not a coincidence. It's God's goodness. And the third thing is, like for the Israelites, we will be more dependent on God. You see, especially if you're somebody here who runs a business, or you've got a role in a business which sort of requires you to keep checking your phone or to keep in contact with customers or clients, there is a temptation that we don't stop. There is a temptation that we just carry on working, that we make every day the same. And yet we are challenged definitely to continue this practice of having rest, of having a break, but that our entire life should be one in which we have a reliance on God to provide, not that we will be doing everything. I'm sure this applies more in farming than any other aspect, where you could be driving a tractor or a combine when it comes to harvest every day of the week. and yet to rest is a challenge, because you just pray that the weather will be good on Monday because it looks great today. Are we going to be able to do what we need to? And we need to trust God to do that. But I think increasingly more and more of our roles could easily spread into 7 full days of work. And we must be careful to protect this time for God, not just one day a week, but in everything that we do, making time that we can pray every day, making time that we can read the Bible, making time to study with others in home groups. These are really important aspects of our Christian life that will do us good. And so we must ensure that we don't simply rely on ourselves. This is a great quote from a theologian called Walter Brueggemann, who says, "Sabbath is the refusal to let one's life be defined by production and consumption and the endless pursuit of private well-being." So it's not just one day. This is about every part of our lives. Are we making space for God? Are we making space for rest? Because the two are critical. Now, one of the other books I'm going to wave in front of you now is an incredible book that I have seen waved around in, and I'm going to use the term secular business conferences, as people saying this is an amazing book to read. And yet it's written by not only a Christian, but a very, very powerful ministry pastor called John Mark Comer. I don't know how many of you have seen this book. This is called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. Amazing book. In fact, I picked this up in a secular bookshop in the States. That's just the difference it's making to a lot of people. The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. Let me just quote what he's put here. "There is a discipline to the Sabbath that is really hard for a lot of us." Sure we'd all agree with that. "It takes a lot of intentionality. It won't just happen to you," because we sometimes think rest just happens. It doesn't. It takes planning and preparation. It takes self-control, the capacity to say no to a list of good things, okay? Good things. So you can say yes to the best. I love that phrase. But Sabbath is the primary discipline or practice by which we cultivate the spirit of restfulness in our lives as a whole. The Sabbath is to a spirit of restfulness what a soccer practice is to a match, or a band practice is to a show. In other words, it is training for us, okay? It's how we practice, it's how we prepare our minds and bodies for the moments that matter most. In other words, using something weekly as a way of stopping our regular life is something that will help us throughout the rest of our lives. Let's look at another great recent theologian, Gary Neville. Some of you may have heard this absolutely incredible interview that he made with Stephen Bartlett, who runs a podcast called Diary of a CEO. Stephen Bartlett's a fascinating character and has actually had 2 or 3 very high-profile Christians on there who have been explaining the Bible to him. It's absolutely fascinating, and I would suggest you just look up some of the things he's been doing. But let me just show you what Gary Neville said. This is the segue into retirement, okay? So Gary Neville says this, "What I try to do is to have a mini retirement throughout the year." Stephen Bartlett says, "That's a weekend." Gary Neville said, "This weekend I'm going to Spain, Friday till Monday morning. I call that, it's like a mini retirement." Stephen Bartlett says, "That's a weekend," which I think is absolutely marvellous. But yeah, people have different ways of taking a break. So anyway, let's move on about what then does the Bible say about retirement, not just Gary Neville. Is it just a long holiday? Is it just for leisure? And should we simply stop all our commitments because we're retired? Now, I'm coming at this from somebody who looks at, with a lot of people, at the financial aspects of retirement. We'll come to that in a moment. But let me just point you to 2 interesting books. Half-time and full-time. So again, I'll just explain each of these. I haven't got them because I've clearly lent them to somebody, but I don't know where they are. But I haven't got the hard copies. So half-time was written in the 70s or 80s by this guy called Bob Buford. And Bob Buford's principal thinking was what it says in the middle there, that we move from success, as he calls it, to significance. And his idea is that you spend the first half of your life putting everything into your work and you become really successful in your work. And in the second half, his term, it's the term I hate, you give back and you sort of use all that knowledge and experience to educate other people and bring them on. And there's an aspect to that which is quite powerful and quite useful. And I certainly think that as we accumulate knowledge, it's important to give that information on to others. But David Bahnsen is a bit of a hero of mine, David Bahnsen. He wrote this a couple of years ago, full time, and it was almost a bit of a pushback on what Bob Buford put. And David's point is this, that actually we should spend our whole lives being useful. We should spend our whole lives doing what work we can. And again, remember the thing that we talked about your front line, about using our front line to communicate the gospel and using our front line to be beneficial to others and train others. So there are these sort of two slightly opposing things, but I'll just put them up there for you to consider. So let's look at a history of retirement in the UK. We could go back to 19th century Germany for Otto von Bismarck and the first state pension, but we're going to talk about the UK. The modern state pension system began in 1908. The Old Age Pensions Act provided a weekly payment of 5 shillings to single people over 70 with an annual income of £31 or less. So in other words, it was means tested. You had to have an annual income under £31 in order to get your 5 shillings a week. Now, the important thing to know there is that life expectancy around then was around 50. So in other words, you had to live 20 years beyond the typical life expectancy, and almost as a reward for that, you get 5 shillings, which is particularly generous. But it was different times, wasn't it? And it was only in 1946, after the Second World War, that the National Insurance Act introduced the basic state pension, which was funded by national insurance contributions. Now, I will just say, if you think your national insurance contributions now go towards your state pension, you are deluded. What goes in your national insurance now is probably spent next week. So it's just the way it works. It's not building up your own pot. Anyway, let's have a look at how things are now, because this is all very relevant. In 2026, state pension age is currently 66, shortly to increase to 67. And the current what's called the new state pension is £241.30 a week, assuming you've had sufficient qualifying years. I'm not going to talk through all of that now. That's the day job. I'm not going to do it. I'm tempted. No. Life expectancy was around 50. Now it's around 82 years. So now we're saying that you receive this currently 16 years before typical life expectancy. Then it was 20 years after. Can you see the difference that we've changed, how much this has changed in 120 years? So what does that say about our country? Well, we live in an amazing time. And we need to understand that as Christians. We live in an amazing time in actually a very generous country. And the state, through general taxation, it isn't any more national insurance, don't believe that it is, pays those who reach 66 or 67 years old. It pays you for reaching that age, as long as you've done some work, which is your qualifying years and so on. And with average life expectancy, it does so for around 15 years, compared with 1908, where life expectancy was 50 and pensions started at 70. So how can we use these circumstances in God's kingdom? Well, first of all, it depends on our health, doesn't it? We all know people who have reached retirement age and their health has not been good. And perhaps all those expectations, those plans, those ideas that they'd had aren't able to be fulfilled. But our early years of retirement can be very different from more advanced years. And our spirit may be willing, but our body may be weak. The other thing that's really important, because you might have been wondering where I was going to dig all this up from, is retirement is not a word that's found in the Bible. So our concept of retirement is not something that's a biblical thing. It's what our society has come up with. However, we may still have responsibilities. If people are able to retire in their early 60s now, they may have parents still around, and they may now have responsibility for grandchildren too, which is wonderful. But they are different times to perhaps how everything was planned. And the other thing we need to think about is that Moses led the Israelites. Sorry, I wasn't clicking in time. Moses led the Israelites between the ages of 80 and 120. So I don't know who the eldest folk here today, but your best years may yet be ahead of you. God might have something planned for you. You don't know. Right. So what principles again can we apply here to what does the Bible tell us? Well, 1 Corinthians 10, 23 to 33 gives us this amazing essay that Paul wrote about the believer's freedom, about what we can do, but what we should do, because those things can be different. Let me just read these key verses. I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. So let's just apply that to the concept of retirement, okay? So you have the right to walk away from work and do nothing ever again. But actually, is that beneficial? Is that beneficial for you as an individual? Is it beneficial for the church as a whole? Is it beneficial for God's people? Or are you able to use some of your extra time to do something else? Is there something that perhaps you can't do while you're working that you could do when you've retired? Because we're told here that whatever we do, whatever it is, eating, drinking, whatever, it should be for the glory of God. So we need to be thinking as Christians, whether we are in retirement, pre-retirement, or a long way from retirement, about how is God going to use my time for his purposes. Because if we said it applies to work, then it certainly applies outside of work. So this is a sort of chart that we use quite a lot at work, where we're planning with people about the amount that they've got and what they're going to have in the future. And we have this thing that ultimately most people are asking at the back of their heads is, do I have enough? So you do need to go through that exercise. And one of the interesting things is once we can evidence to people that they do, we then need to say, so how much of that do you still need? Or how much of that can you afford to now give away? Because we should be thinking, if we're blessed from a perspective of abundance, what God has given to us, is there something we can give now that will benefit people now? Because I may not need it later on. But we need to be very careful about that aspect. The other thing that we need to be thinking about is this, that we're not just retiring from something, but we need to be clearly thinking about what we're retiring to. And some of the hardest things I've had to deal with are people who've said, I can't stand my job, I want to leave, I'm going to retire. So we work on everything, and 3-4 months down the line, they come back and say, actually, I'm going to go back to work now because I just can't stand it. So we need to be thinking about what we're retiring to. That might be funny to some people, but it is genuinely true. So one of the things we sometimes sketch out for people, and I would encourage all Christians approaching retirement to do this, that you've effectively got 21 different slots during the week. So you've got morning, afternoon and evening, although I would always slip in a breakfast meeting in there as well. I think that's probably another one. Morning, afternoon and evening, and you've got 7 days. So we'd often say to someone, how are you going to fill that time? Okay, because work takes up a fair bit of that at the moment. How are you going to fill that? Now, one of the things we often get back is this. Oh, that's easy. And for a lot of people, that does seem to be their primary objective, which I really don't understand. But anyway, so be it. That's what it is. But then we start to talk about, and I would certainly be thinking about this as if you're a Christian approaching this, think about, could you put some other things in? I'd like to think so. So, for example, I've just put a few things on there that you'll have church, family, and obviously country file on a Sunday. And then Monday, you may be doing a book club, bowls club, or so maybe babysitting, lunch out, volunteering, and of course, bingo on a Friday. But anyway, I've just put a few different things on there that, you know, obviously just work. But think about things ahead and say, God, if you're going to direct my life, and I love my job, but I know that at some point I've got to give it up, how are you going to use your time? Because we live in this incredible society where that we get money from the state for being alive at 66. And essentially, is that a way that can support us to do different things for God? Incidentally, while I put bowls up there just to spark my memory, I remember a pastor many years ago who I spoke to who I was saying, oh, what are you doing? Or he said, yeah, well, I'm doing this, that, and the other. And then I've got bowls club on Tuesday. And I said, bowls? You know, I didn't realise you were into bowls. And he said, I've realised that's the only way I can meet non-Christians. And the issue is so often as people who love church and love Christian people that we don't mix with other people. How do they know about Jesus if we don't mix with them? So maybe look more intentionally for opportunities of meeting others using things like bowls, not exclusively bowls, clearly, although I'm sure they need saving. So let's think about how we then apply all of this, and let's wrap this topic up. I haven't dealt with it in huge amount of detail just because of time, but I hope that the principles were helpful. So what have we learned so far? Our whole life matters to God. No secular sacred divide. Everything can be used for God's glory, whether that's our work, whether it's our free time, our spare time, our retirement, and everything belongs to God. So it's not my pension pot, that's God's. It's not my investment, it's God's. It's not what I'm saving for in the bank, that's God's. It's not my house, God has given it to me for me to use for his glory. We are accountable, I am accountable for how we use all of those things. So can we use any of our time in God's work? Well, what are the principles we've seen? That everything belongs to God. We are only stewards. God is interested in everything that we do. And he can use everything we do for his glory. Our work time, our leisure time, our family time, and even our retirement. But the question is this: are you willing? Are you willing to allow God to influence every aspect of your life? You see, we've thought today about the need to trust God in our rest, but the biggest thing that we can trust God with isn't our time, isn't our money, it's our salvation. The biggest thing we can trust God with is to say, I trust you in what you have done for me through the Lord Jesus Christ, on him taking all the wrong things that I've done and dealing with them. And it's only through that I can have peace with God and I can be right with him. So if that's the biggest thing in my life, then money, my possessions, my profession, my retirement, my spare time, all of those things are actually pretty straightforward by comparison with the knowledge that God, through the goodness of the Lord Jesus, has dealt with my sin through what he has done on the cross. So if I can trust him with that, then surely I can trust him with all these things we've been dealing with over these last few weeks. Just want to leave you with those two proper quotes, not the songs, which you can tell my head is often full of songs. The only Christian work is good work, well done, whether it's church embroidery or sewage farming. That quote is so powerful. So whatever you do, your Christian work can be beneficial, and it will be shown by the way that you work. And then this by Abraham Kuyper, which is, in the total expanse of human life, there is not a square inch of which the Christ, who died for me, who alone is sovereign, does not declare, that is mine. How can I possibly, with everything that God has done for me and everything that Jesus has done for me, how can I possibly say this bit actually still belongs to me? I've got to acknowledge that he is sovereign of everything. so there is not 1 square inch which is mine. I hope that as we've worked through these 3 headings over these last few weeks, that you've understood that God isn't a far-off God. God isn't a God who simply gives us instructions on praying and reading and meeting together. This is a God who has a Bible, has his word chock full of really down-to-earth, helpful pointers as to how we can live our real life, how we can do that in front of others. I've got some more books here. If you want to have a chat later, I can point you in the direction of helpful things to read, and they'll say things better than I've done over these last few weeks. But maybe we can just conclude by asking God to work through us, and let's just pray together. Heavenly Father, we just want to thank you for being in such a privileged position. We recognise the fact that we are in a country which is very generous. We realise it has its faults, we realise it has its frustrations, and those things can be very real at times. But we also recognise that you are so good to us. You are so good to us in so many ways. And we just pray that you will help us not to take those things for granted, that we will thank you for your blessings daily, and for your goodness to us, for the way in which you've provided for us in so many ways. And we just pray that you will then help us to examine how we spend our time. You will help us to examine about how we think of the future. You will help us to examine about the way we look at our workplace and our bank accounts, to just acknowledge the fact that we are stewards of everything that you've given to us. That the money in our account, the house, the car, the time that we have, the pension that we're looking forward to are things that have been given to us by you. We can't take them with us. They are things that you will require an account of how we've used them. So we just pray that you will help each of us to apply these to our own lives. We recognise that everybody is different here. We have different responsibilities. We have different situations in which we find ourselves, but we just pray that you will guide us and direct us and bring us close to you so that we will know how you should lead us in the future. We ask these things in Jesus' name and for his glory. Amen.